And finally, Jacob comes to Bethel. Here, Jacob builds an altar and calls on God's name. But he calls to El Bethel, or God of Bethel, instead of El Elohi Israel, which means my God, and God for me. Jacob came down from the position in which he was the subject. And finally, he receives God's blessing, the eternal and unchanging Word of God. One story. 12. Jacob 2. Genesis chapter 27 to 35. When Jacob was still in his mother's womb, he was chosen and distinguished by God. But he still deceived his brother and father to receive the blessing he badly wanted. And because of that blessing, he became a fugitive and met God in Bethel. But because he has yet to recognize and acknowledge God in his life, he forgets what he is supposed to be doing and where he truly belongs, and instead spends happy time with his beloved Rachel in his uncle Laban's home. And finally, with God's interference, his life and environment, which was supposed to prosper with his father's blessing, began to corner him, and finally, Jacob leaves his uncle and father-in-law Laban's home. No. He runs away. Go back to your tribe, your ancestors' land. God insists only on the land of Canaan. He repeats this to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. Then the Lord said to Jacob, Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. The reason why God is trying to place God's people in Canaan will be examined in the one story and in the part of Joshua. Jacob summons Leah and Rachel and complains of his troubled times, which was difficult because of his father-in-law Laban. And he tells them that God said, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. Then with the consent of Leah and Rachel, they leave Laban's house. Rather than Jacob obeying God, this is more like God leading Jacob out. Jacob had to leave Laban's house when his environment became difficult, internally and externally, but he still doesn't have the mind of let's go to Bethel. Returning to Bethel. Half because of himself, half because of others, now Jacob is returning to Bethel. But this road will not be smooth because he has not yet surrendered in his heart. And there are some mountains that Jacob must overcome before he can come to Bethel. Laban chasing him from behind and Esau threatening him in front. Even the Shechem prepared, but God decisively. Of course, God will protect the way through his angels. Laban's pursuit. Jacob, who already had discomfort with Laban's sons, flees Laban and his sons just as he escaped Esau. This time not alone, but with 4 wives, 11 sons, and 1 daughter. And Laban realized this 3 days after they fled, and for 7 days he chased them until he reached Jacob's party. Jacob probably had a lot to say in his mind, but Laban would have felt betrayed not only from Jacob but also from his 2 daughters. But again the God who protected Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob interferes again. Even before Laban arrives to Jacob, God tells Laban in his dream, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Laban reveals his regrets, but only searches for his idol, Darabim. Hearing Jacob's complaint, he makes a covenant with Jacob and returns. If God protects them, the worldly king and Satan cannot do anything to God's children. Now Jacob has overcome 1 small mountain in his journey back to Bethel, preparing to meet Esau. Jacob is not a special person. Jacob's slyness, deception, ignorance, and his methods to live in this world are like the sections of our lives. As Jacob nears Bethel, his hometown where he vowed to God, he prepares to greet his brother Esau. He was afraid of his brother. First he sent spies to check his brother's sympathy. He sent them to sweet talk, telling them to convey, I want to be favored by my Lord. However, the depressing news that came back was that Esau was coming to Jacob with 400 people. Second, upon the news of Esau, Jacob divides his companions and the livestock into 2 groups. It was a precaution in case Esau struck one group so the other group can escape. Third, he prays to God, whom he has never searched for before. In a word, he prayed, God, the God of my grandfather and the God of my father, you said that if I come back to this land, I will be blessed. And of course, you gave me plenty until now. But my prayer is to save me from my brother Esau's hands. I am so afraid. God surely said to me that he will surely make me prosper and will make my descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. We can see that this prayer is very self-centered, insincere, and childish. However, even after praying, Jacob prepares to offer gifts to relieve his brother Esau's feelings. Quite a big number of offerings. Jacob divides the offerings from the wealth he has collected over the past 2 decades, while the heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. Then he divides the gifts into 3 groups, strategically distanced, and sends it to Esau ahead of Jacob's party. He also sends message to convey to Esau with the gifts. However, Jacob is still not relieved, so after spending the night, he sends his wife, sons, and possession across the Jabbok River and is left alone. There is still a long way to go, but he is now left alone like he was when he vowed to God in Bethel. He now has to negotiate with God. It is Jacob. Jacob remains alone and wrestles with someone all night. It shows how this time was difficult and his heart was heavy. And the man who is represented as God and as an angel cannot win against Jacob. God does not pressure God's children, whom he loves by force. It is not because of lack of power or strength, but because of love. Of course, it will eventually be made with God's zeal, but in the circumstances and situations, it seems like letting the immature children get what they want. Then the angel strikes Jacob's thigh joint. Jacob was hit on the central point of the body. In other words, it hits Jacob's self-centeredness that Jacob had been holding. And the angel asks for Jacob's name, who wanted the angel to bless him. Before, when his father Isaac asked, "Who are you?" the person who risked his life for the blessing and said, "I am Esau," is now answering, "I am Jacob." There is still a long way to go on a journey as a foreigner, but here, one level is self-denial. The angel gives Jacob a new name. He is said to be called Israel. It means he won with God and the people. He wanted prosperity, not 4 wives and 12 children. Nor did he want to have problems with his father-in-law Laban and his brothers-in-law. The problem with Laban was solved. But Jacob, who is in a state of despair in front of Esau, leading 400 people towards him, is called as a winner in the Bible. It is victory when one's lack and fault are recognized. And Jacob now receives the blessing of the angel in his own name, not the blessing of Esau. Esau's hospitality. The 400 people Esau brought were props used by God to save Jacob from the world. As soon as Jacob stands up straight, he will see that it is nothing but just a stage prop, but otherwise he will still be fearful. It's as if Abraham left Mesopotamia, the land of abundance, and received a great call in Haran, but still feared Pharaoh and his servants in Egypt. It is like when Isaac became the incomprehensible burnt offering of his father Abraham and obeyed God and did not go down to Egypt, but he still feared the king of Gerar and deceived that his wife Rebekah was his sister. Jacob's name has changed, but he is still afraid of his brother. When Jacob sees his brother Esau and his 400 men, he divides his people and possessions into 3 groups again. The servant girls and their children are at the head, Leah and her children next, and the most beloved women, Rachel and her son Joseph, are at the rear. And like this, Jacob meets Esau. Then he bows to Esau 7 times, but his brother has no feelings of fate or revenge against Jacob. It was not changed because Jacob prayed earnestly, but because God had already released Esau's anger. Nevertheless, because of the people and situation, Jacob, who cannot see or recognize the hand of God supporting him, says to his brother Esau, "To see your face is like seeing the face of God." God solved everything, but the glory is given to Esau. Nevertheless, God solves Jacob's problems. After separating from Esau with his sweet talks, who wanted to go together, Jacob heads back to his hometown, and his heart that was slowly suppressed to a servant slowly began to come up and try to become a king again. If he suffered and struggled this much and God helped him this much, he has to say, "Yes, God, now I will only serve God as my king and live as a child who obeys." But it is difficult to escape from the sinner's life. After all the visible difficulties disappeared, it is still not enough to go to Bethel and build an altar again. However, when Jacob reached Shechem, he built a place for himself, built shelter for his livestock, set up a tent, bought a field, built an altar there, and said, El Elohi Israel. It means God of Israel. In other words, his changed name is Israel, so it becomes my God. But this is not Jacob's confession of faith, and instead it means God exists for me, because God helped me this much. Perhaps if he suffers 100 times more than he already did, he would come to his senses. At Shechem. Shechem was not a place to stay, but a place that Jacob had to pass quickly to go to Bethel. However, when the threat of Laban and his sons and the fear of his brother Esau and his 400 people are gone, Jacob releases his desperate heart and settles in Shechem, even though God always called him to Bethel and never told him to stay in Shechem. Finally, in the city of Shechem, his only daughter, Dinah, went out to see Shechem's daughters and was raped by the chief of the land, one of the sons of Hamor, from whom Jacob bought a field. And the incident was the rage of Jacob's sons. And all men in the city were circumcised with the lie that if every man who will be circumcised and become like us, they will marry. Then Simeon and Levi sneaked in with swords to kill all the men and bring Dinah back. Jacob's other sons looted the city and avenged the city with blood. Jacob was facing a severe punishment because he stayed at a place he should have just passed. Now Jacob can't stand it anymore. It is until this point. Go to Bethel, build an altar. At this time God appears and speaks. He waited patiently and kept watching until Jacob finally completely surrendered before God spoke to Jacob again. This is God's zeal. Then God said to Jacob, Go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. It means go there as you vowed to me when you ran away from your brother. God is fearful. He has not forgotten anything. Eventually, Jacob rids his status as a child and sinner's life. Jacob tells everyone he was with to get rid of foreign gods. Not only Rachel, but many people who served God had foreign idols as well. It is no different from these days. Jacob tells them to purify themselves. This does not mean to take a bath and wash, but it means to restore their spiritual faith. He also says, change your clothes. He could have meant to literally change the clothes, but clothes can represent life. So it means to abandon idols, restore faith, and change lives. And then he shouted. He said, Then come, let us go to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone. God is really amazing, and Jacob spent a long, tough time. Eventually they buried foreign gods they had hidden and the rings in their ears, the materials for idols, in Shechem and left the city. This is what is meant by decision. It's not just talking, it's burying it. Then God builds them a highway. He held the towns around them in fear so that no one can touch Jacob and his company. And this kind of God siding with his children has been repeated several times in the past and will continue to appear in the future. God blessed him and said, You will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. It is not the blessing of the world that Jacob wanted to receive. He already gave the worldly things to his older brother Esau on his way, and he buried the idols and earrings as well. God also tells Jacob, A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. God was talking about the beginning of a nation that will be achieved through Jacob. And again, God promised to give the land that he gave to Abraham and Isaac, Canaan, to Jacob and his descendants. In Jacob's life, there is nothing he can hold on to and enjoy. However, the Bible says that God blessed Jacob. Jacob received the real thing from God. Jacob, who belonged to this earth and sought for things on this earth, received the life of a foreigner who belongs to God and seeks God and does not care about anything in this earth. Jacob lives the foreigner's life to his hometown. Now Jacob, who has really received the blessing from God, quickly disappears from the Bible. The Bible also records the death of his mother, Rebekah's nanny, the death of his beloved wife, Rachel, and the death of his father, Isaac. An incident occurs regarding Reuben, the eldest son, sleeping with Rachel's maid. After being blessed by God, everything does not go according to Jacob's wishes or will, but instead an environment was made to make his heart leave this world. Now Jacob will be buried in the story of his son Joseph and appear in the Bible as supporting character rather than the main character. Jacob later confessed before the king of Egypt like this: "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Jacob, who is resting. Before his death, Jacob tells Joseph, "When I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." Jacob now clearly knows where his hometown is. He is standing as a person of faith who longs for his hometown, not only with his body but also with the mind, just like his ancestors of the faith. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Then Jacob summons his sons before his death and says, "I will tell you what will happen to you in the days to come." Here the reason why Jacob can say that he can tell them about their days to come is because he has experienced the devastating defeat in his life and the precise, clear interference and care of God throughout his lifetime. Jacob also knew how his sons lived their lives because after having his 12 sons, Jacob spent nearly 40 years with them. Salvation and calling are done by God's grace, but living as a blessed man on this earth, as a man of God, as a people of God, depends on the fruits of our lives. Jacob proved this throughout his life. Jacob dies. The Bible says that just as Abraham died and Isaac died, Jacob died and returned to his people, his fathers. It was Jacob who was distinguished from the time he was in the mother's womb and was born as a cradle Christian. But to get the worldly blessing, used every trick he can and finally got his father's blessing. And eventually through that blessing, it was Jacob who had to go through harsh years in his life. However, God is still speaking to us through Jacob, who closed his heart on this earth and lived the life of a traveler until he was called to God's rest. Now one story continues with Joseph's story that will fulfill God's vision throughout his life without going through the up and down because he is tied with Jacob.